Good evening, everyone.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Shakespeare and Company, and to this, our last event of 2017. And what a way to finish. We are delighted to be joined by Andy Miller and John Mitchinson, otherwise known as the creators of the massively popular and stupendously entertaining podcast Backlisted, the show that breathes new life into old books. Tonight, John and Andy are here to host an evening of great lost books, discussing 6 works you may never have heard of, or that you may have heard of but never have read, or possibly that you've both heard of and read, but if that's the case, keep it to yourself because nobody likes a smartass. They'll also be asking how books get lost in the first place and why they get found again. Andy Miller is a reader, editor and author, most recently of The Year of Reading Dangerously. He's also written books about how much he likes the Kinks and how much he dislikes sport. His work has appeared in numerous publications, including The Times, Telegraph, The Guardian, The Spectator and Mojo, and he's written about film for the BFI. He is reader in residence at this year's Durham Book Festival. John Mitchinson is a writer and publisher and the co-founder of Unbound, the world's leading crowdfunding platform for books. Before that, he helped to found the award-winning BBC TV show QI. As a publisher, he's worked with an eclectic list of authors, including the Beatles, Haruki Murakami, Richard Ford, and a woman who knitted with dog hair. He is vice president of the Hay Festival of Arts and Literature. In his spare time, he keeps pigs, sheep, chickens, and bees. Please join me in welcoming John Mitchinson and Andy Miller to Shakespeare and Company.
Thanks very much.
Yes, thank you.
Merry Christmas, everyone.
Yes, Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. Thank you, Adam, for that very nice introduction. How many people here have ever heard an episode of our podcast Backlisted? All of you.
That's amazing.
That's amazing. Who would have thought it would have had such penetration?
In a way, that's a relief.
Into France. That's good. Why don't we spend a bit of time, John, explaining what Backlisted is?
Exactly that, Andy. Backlisted started as all these things start, I guess, as a sort of conversation. Andy and I were at a literary festival. I'd been thinking for a long time about why all the promotion in the publishing industry is geared to new books. Nothing wrong with new books. We need new books. We need new writers. We need to support them. But all the great late night conversations I've had about books, where people really pour out their hearts and say, "You've got to read this. This book. I read this book when I was 15. I read this book when I was 27. I read this book when I was 17. It changed my life." It tended to be about books that had been around for a long time. So, and it seemed to me that if you were going to get the podcast format, that sort of intimacy, that there was so little time spent where you had time to really get into the conversations. We both started as booksellers, and we were very lucky early days of Waterstones in the 80s, early 90s. And all we did was really read books.
Well, what we want, the thing is, so I've been a bookseller and a publisher and a writer.
Gamekeeper.
A human being occasionally.
Yeah.
And the best conversations that I ever had about books were in the tea room in Waterstones in Kensington High Street in about 1995, because what you had, because of the socio-economic situation in that period, were lots of people with degrees who couldn't get good jobs, who went to work in bookshops because they loved books.
Yeah.
And so when we put Backlisted together, the note that we wanted to hit was we wanted the conversation to be like the conversations that we used to have in the tea room during your break off the shop floor for 20 minutes of Waterstones, which is basically people arguing about books and being rude about the customers. Not about you lovely people. I'm sure you are not the sort of people who we would go upstairs and be rude about. But that was the idea. The idea was to have a conversation about books which was not academic, was based on knowledge and enthusiasm, those two things.
And a certain kind of warmth, I think. We felt that a lot of the stuff that you do get where books are discussed, they're either discussed in a super academic way, which is fine if you're studying literature, but that what people want, there's something about the discovery, the reading of a book for the first time, and we've done 57 podcasts now. We've just recorded our 58th upstairs here today, and I think of those, we always ask the guests, who tend to be writers, not always, but usually, we get our guests to suggest the book that they want to bring. Andy and I made a long list when we started of the books that we'd really like to talk about, and we've talked about a fair few of those, but I think I've probably only read about 10, and probably more than that, of the books that we've done. So a lot of the books you're reading for the first time, and I think there is also, to read a book that somebody else is passionately kind of in favour of, and then sharing that with them. I think that is it's huge fun to do, and I hope that comes across in the podcast.
Also, we've realised that we've been very lucky to be talking about classic books or lost books. We had a rule, for instance, that if we did a well-known author on Backlisted, we wouldn't do their best-known book. So we're still very keen to do William Golding, but we don't want to do Lord of the Flies. We want to do The Inheritors or The Spire. Those are our two. Yeah. But we realise we've been very lucky that if we were doing this 10 years ago even, it would be much more difficult for people who listen to the podcast, not that the podcast would have existed then, but to find the books.
Yeah.
And we realised that the combination of the internet and print on demand and e-books and all sorts of things like that have meant that the books that we're going to talk about tonight are not necessarily obscure books. They are books that are for sale here in the shop and that you could track down quite easily, but at various points in their lives they have been lost. And the stories of how books get lost, why books get lost, is one that we're constantly talking about with our guests on Backlisted. I think I apologise if you I'm probably repeating myself from last year, but an example of a great lost book would be Moby Dick by Herman Melville, which was published in the 1850s, but it wasn't until after the First World War that it became well known. If for some reason we were talking about this book 100 years ago, it's a very safe bet that none of you would have heard of Moby Dick by Herman Melville. The first edition of Moby Dick was an edition of 3,000 copies, and it took 40 years for it to sell through, and that is taking into account a warehouse fire that destroyed half the stock. And there are two reasons why Moby Dick took a while to find an audience. First of all, it's insane. It's a wonderful book. It's a work of genius, and it's also crazy. Both those things are true at the same time, and it took several generations of readers to begin to be able to appreciate the book. If we were talking about a real lost book by Melville, in fact, the novel that Melville wrote, not after Moby Dick, but the one after that, is a great lost book because there is no trace of the manuscript. Herman Melville found it increasingly difficult to get published, and he spent the last 20 years of his life working as a customs officer. He wrote several more novels. One of them was rejected so thoroughly that it's disappeared off the face of the earth. It's one of the great literary treasures, should it ever be found. So we're going to talk about a selection of books which are either lost now, or have been lost, or have come back, or you should have heard of, and if you haven't heard of, if you read them, and we're confident of a pretty high success rate, aren't we?
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure none of these have been, massive bestsellers. I don't think.
No. Do you want to kick off then?
I'll kick off. I mean, this is a very good example of a sort of a book that's been in and out of popular consciousness. It's a book called Haunts of the Black Masseur.
I'm going to do this every time we mention a book. I'm going to do a count of hands.
Yeah.
How many people have heard of the book Haunts of the Black Masseur by Charles Sprawson? One, and he works in the shop.
Okay, so Haunts of the Black Masseur was published in, this is get on top of your material, was published in 1992. It is, the subtitle is The Swimmer's Hero. It is the only book, I think, that Charles Sprawson has published.
It is.
It is a book about swimming, which is the very simplest way of describing it. It's a book about the importance of swimming in literature. Now, one of the things, I read this book when I was still Actually, no, I'd stopped being a bookseller, but I was a publisher. And it was one of those books that very quickly gathered a cult following in proof amongst booksellers, because it was so original. The idea of taking a subject like swimming and writing, it's a very odd, strange, elusive book. It lays out its territory going back through classical literature, obviously, through to the Romantic poets. It carries on right through the 20th century, Johnny Weissmuller as Tarzan, the films of Leni Riefenstahl. It's a kind of an attempt to investigate swimming, but the key to the story is there's not a massive bibliography, there's not much in the way of footnotes. It's an incredibly personal story. Sprawson, kind of odd, a scholar. I mean, we talked about in the podcast that this book maybe would have been impossible to do in the internet age, because you would have been able to just go and find all this stuff. This is 30, maybe longer, years' work of libraries and tracking down relentlessly.
It's a work of obsession. That's the thing. It's obsession in an era where, if you wanted to find out the history of swimming the Hellespont, you had to go to a number of libraries around the world. One of the things that's incredible about the book is the density of research material.
Yeah.
I can tell you, as a writer myself, I read it and it slightly gives me anxiety, because clearly there'll be a sentence or a fact that he's clearly had to read a 500-page book to get.
Yeah.
He's got one fact out of that book, and then he's on to the next thing, right? It's the most labour-intensive way of putting a book together.
It's the closest, I think. I was lucky enough to go on and publish W.G. Sebald, Max Sebald at Harville. It has that kind of flavour to it. It is suffused with kind of learning that is not exactly lightly worn. I mean, it's there, but it's not an academic book, and it's the melancholy that goes through it. I mean, if there's a bit of water, Sprawson will dive into it and swim in it, and it's, all the time it makes you think about water and immersion and amniotic fluid and there's a sort of magnetic. The number of people, I was one of those people. I became an obsessive swimmer, a wild swimmer, as a result of reading this book. It gets into your bloodstream in a strange kind of way. He's picked what we would now call casually a meme, the swimming meme. There's a great film, The Swimmer, with Burt Lancaster, which is based on a John Cheever short story. That sort of obsessive need to go, a way of looking at suburban life by jumping into people's swimming pools. Every time Sprawson, as I say, sees a bit of water, he has to get in it and sort of own it in some sort of strange way. So the balance between I'm going to read you a little bit. The balance between the personal and the scholarly is very original, and he, for all kinds of reasons, hasn't really managed to write another book.
I've got a theory. Here's my theory. We're going to try and offer a theory as to why each of these books is a lost book. Here's my theory as to why Haunts of the Black Masseur by Charles Sprawson, which already you'll be thinking to yourself, I must read that book. Right, John has done a fantastic number on that book. Right, it is a wonderful, wonderful book. Why is that book not better known? Does anyone have a theory? I've got a theory.
Go on, Andy.
Where would it live in the bookshop?
Yeah. Yeah.
Doesn't quite fit in biography, doesn't fit in sports, doesn't fit in swimming. There isn't a swimming section. It's cultural histories, cultural studies. Nobody goes and looks at that section.
I think all of these books are united in, as I hope we'll make the case for, in the desire to people. These are books that people recommend to one another. Russell Hoban once said to me that his readers basically traded in used paperbacks. The reason he didn't sell so many copies is that people would read Turtle Diary and then give it to their best friend to read, and then and the books would go round when people are on holidays. Sprawson's a bit like that. I'm going to read you just a little bit so you get a bit of flavour. This is him. He's tried and failed miserably to swim the Hellespont, so he's now found a pilot, boat captain to help him across, and he's swimming. I swam side-stroke to avoid looking down. This is already amusing. My dread of deep water stems from a voyage to India at the age of 6, when the ship was delayed for some days in a port on the Red Sea. While waiting to continue the voyage, we took a rowing boat out beyond the reef, and I still remember the experience as clearly as a nightmare. As we rowed out from the shore across the shallow water, the bottom dropped down suddenly at the edge of a steep marine cliff, and we found ourselves floating in clear, smooth water over rocks rising up from an apparently unfathomable depth to quite near the surface. It was a fearful sensation as the boat rose and fell between them. I could not look over the side without feeling extremely giddy, as if suspended on some aerial height, leaning over a tremendous gulf. The sight as a child of those submarine peaks rising abruptly from the seabed has marked my imagination for life. Leave it there. He then goes on to say that he's well, I'll give you a little bit more because it is quite funny. Here in mid-channel, when I did try the crawl for a few yards and was forced to look down through the green water, I became aware of a silvery shape suspended about 20 feet below. It hovered there every time I chanced to look down. No doubt it was only some discarded packing case swaying slowly in the current. But to me at the time, it had every semblance of the underbelly of a shark as it turns on its back to strike. We had been assured that there were no sharks in the area, but they are notorious for emerging in the unlikeliest places, and Byron himself had encountered some large fish in the middle of his crossing. It was at about this stage of his swim that Patrick Lee Fermer had noted a strange fluctuating and hissing noise under his submerged left ear. He too was swimming side-stroke, so old school. This he presumed to be the shifting and grinding of enormous masses of pebbles and silt at the bottom of the sea, revolved by the clash of conflicting currents. But he found out subsequently that it was caused by the presence of Russian submarines. Anyway, and on it goes.
It's such a good book. I'm going to say that at the end of each book. It's such a good book. I feel like
I think we have to take it on trust that we haven't chosen bad books for this. So one nice thing about this story, when we did the podcast, we said they had put a pretty crappy jacket on it, and they'd taken the subtitle off, which seemed kind of odd.
The subtitle is "The Swimmer as Hero," and the fantastic thing about the subtitle, and in a sense, this is why this book is obscure but also wonderful, is "The Swimmer as Hero" is what the book is about. Were you to want to read a book about the history and culture of the iconic figure of the swimmer,
yeah,
Charles Sprawson has written the definitive text on that topic. Shall we move on to the next one? Let's do my first one.
A bit of Parisian.
Okay, so I've chosen this for several reasons, one of which is that it is one of my favourite books. This is Good Morning Midnight by Jean Rhys. How many people have heard of Good Morning Midnight by Jean Rhys? Yes, a few.
Why is it lost, Andy?
It's lost. Well, it's not lost anymore because Jean Rhys's reputation, certainly in the last 10 to 20 years, has soared, I think. But I would like to take you back to 1966, which is the year that Rhys published her final novel, which was called Wide Sargasso Sea. Wide Sargasso Sea is, and was acknowledged as a classic almost immediately upon publication. It won many prizes. Jean Rhys responded famously by saying, "It has come too late." However, when Rhys was writing Wide Sargasso Sea, which took her approximately 15 years, it was widely believed that she was dead. She had published 4 novels in the 1920s and 1930s, of which Good Morning Midnight is the final one, published in 1939, and so obscure was she that she was thought to have died sometime after the Second World War. This book sold hardly at all, and I am very fortunate to have here, I'm holding, and Shakespeare and Co are going to give me this, right? Oh, yeah, they are. Wow, that's so kind. This is a first edition of Good Morning Midnight, a UK first edition copy of Good Morning Midnight, published by Constable in 1939. It sold literally a few hundred copies. It could be yours for €650. The copy I'm holding right here, and I'm going to read a bit from an actual first edition copy of Good Morning Midnight here on the left bank in Paris, where Jean Rhys spent so much time. She was part of the famous literary scene in Paris in the 1920s and 30s. She was discovered by the novelist Ford Madox Ford. She lived in a ménage à trois with Ford Madox Ford and his wife, which is the subject of her first novel, Postures, or as it was subsequently retitled, Quartet. Whenever I read Good Morning Midnight, I've read it 3 or 4 times, I can't believe how far ahead of her time she was. One of the reasons why her works resonate so much now is she writes about what it was to be a woman struggling on her own in London and Paris in the 1930s in a way which owes very little to other writers. And I can imagine, as with Melville, that people reading this in the 1930s, unless they had a particularly refined sensibility, would have simply not been able to understand what was going on in the book they were reading.
Do you think that one of the reasons that people thought she was dead was that her grip on life in those books does seem tenuous? You know, that the sense of a mind right on the edge of sort of disintegration. I mean, which she captures those moments of sort of the hangover, the kind of the failed love affair, the sort of the kind of the pressure. I mean, it's the early novels at least are a most brilliantly accurate account of depression, I think, as has been captured in literature. And there's a sort of doomed feeling about them that maybe, you know, when you read, as I'm sure you pick any chapter of Good Night Midnight, and you feel this woman isn't long for the world.
And yes, you're right. One does feel that, but at the same time, what's so fantastic about Rhys as a writer is she is absolutely made of steel.
Yes, ruthless.
Her willingness to report back from her own unhappiness in a way which is
without a shred of
factually accurate and often bizarrely funny. She is one of my favourite writers, and. So I'm just going to read. What a treat to read just a page here in Shakespeare & Co. I'll read a little bit about Paris, which I think will give you a flavour. Actually, Lauren Elkin, in her book Flaneurs, writes very interestingly about Rhys as a woman who walked the streets of London and Paris and wrote about that experience. And the bit I'm going to read now is relevant to that idea of Rhys. I am not at all sad as I walk back to the hotel. When I remember how one well-directed "Oh my God" lays me out flat in London, I can only marvel at the effect this place has on me. I expect it is because the drink is so much better. No, I'm not sad. But by the time I get to the Boulevard Saint-Michel, I am feeling tired. I have walked along here so often feeling tired. Here is the fountain with the beautiful prancing horses. There is a tabac where I can have a drink near the next statue, the quinine statue. Just then 2 men come up from behind and walk along on either side of me. One of them says, "Pourquoi êtes-vous si triste?" Yes, I am sad. Sad as a circus lioness. Sad as an eagle without wings. Sad as a violin with only one string and that one broken. Sad as a woman who is growing old. Sad, sad, sad. Or perhaps, if I just said merde, it would do as well. I don't speak and we walk along in silence. Then I say, but I'm not sad. Why should you think I'm sad? Is it a ritual? Am I bound to answer the same question in the same words? We stop under a lamppost to guess nationalities. That's such a good sentence. We stop under a lamppost to guess nationalities. So they say, though I expect it is because they want to have a closer look at me. They tactfully don't guess mine. Are they Germans? No. Scandinavians, perhaps? No. The shorter one says they are Russians. When I hear that, I at once accept their offer to go and have a drink. Les Russes. That'll wind up the evening nicely. It's so wonderful, this book. You can open this book at any page and find some beautiful piece of prose to enjoy. And I would struggle. I was thinking, was I going to try and explain what the plot of Good Morning Midnight is? I don't think I can. I don't even know. I've read this book 3 or 4 times. I don't know. But it doesn't matter. It's like Reese's found a middle ground between writing and talking to herself in such a way that illuminates for the reader the landscape of her life. The wonderful book.
I'm now beginning to wonder whether there is some secret link between all these books, but we'll have to see.
Drinking and misery.
Drinking. Well, there's a fair bit of both actually in the book. The next book, which is again, we'll do the Desperate Characters by Paula Fox. Have any of you read it? Okay. Well, you've all got a treat in store. Now, this is a lost book because it is actually more or less not known by most people. And Paula Fox, very interesting writer, had 3 careers, really. One as a children's author, where she was very successful. One as the author of a series of adult novels, which weren't terribly successful, and of which I think Desperate Characters is the most significant. And then also she was a memoirist, and I guess those are the books. What was the last volume of memoir called? Can you remember?
I really can't.
I can't either.
Sorry.
Anyway, it's a wonderful book. She had a nightmarish childhood where she was totally estranged from her parents, and I think that bad childhoods are kind of all the books that she's written, her children's novels and her adult novels. But Desperate Characters is set very specifically in New York in 1968. It's a couple, a upper middle class couple who have moved into they're basically gentrifying a house in Brooklyn, and there is a sense of menace. The book is about their life, their failing marriage. But really what it's about is about a cat. It's about a cat that Sophie, the main character, Sophie and Otto Bentwood.
That's right.
The name Bentwood has significance. It's one of those books that is superficially a novel of middle class life and manners. There's a marvellous early scene of a party which is very Woody Allen-like, lots of people kind of turkey cocking and exchanging numbers. But really what it is it's almost gothic in the undercurrents, the sense of the encroaching menace. Things start to go wrong, and what happens with the cat is that the cat is being fed and suddenly turns on Sophie and bites her very, very badly. So there is a bit of plot, unlike the previous two, but bites her, and then they have to take the cat and go and get her treated for rabies, the Sophie treated for rabies. This sounds like a very simple thing, but getting the cat into the box is not easy. It's one of the most, and then the cat in the box is one of the most terrifying. It's just one of the most terrifying things. It's sort of there's seepage and there's noise and there's kind of, and essentially what Paula Fox does, I think, in this book, and it's in its most modern version, it comes with an amazing kind of encomium from Jonathan Franzen, who said it's clearly a masterpiece and better than anything that Philip Roth, Saul Bellow and John Updike have written, which is a pretty big claim. Although I think I think that's very much John. That's very much Franson sort of knocking it out of there. It is, I think, and I think it is a great book, and I think it's a great book. It's 150 pages long. It is in that. We're going to talk about another one of them in that Gatsby tradition of the short novel that doesn't. The first time you read it, you have to go right back to the beginning again and try and get to the bottom of what's going on, all the dark undercurrents, the wife having an affair that she's remembering through the book, the failing business that Otto, and he's just sacked his partner of long-standing, Charlie, all of these complications. But what glues it together, and I'm just going to read you a little bit of it because I think it's one of those books that once you get past the mildly amusing idea of the cat as the central kind of plot device, the MacGuffin, what you have is a very dark sense of a kind of modern culture that is beginning to lose its self-confidence, its sense of control, and she manages that. I'll read you. It's easier to read. This is what's happened. Sophie's come back from the vet, from the doctor. She hasn't got rabies. She has managed to get shot of the cat, which is a good thing. And she's decided to go to bed and with her husband Otto. Otto always turned off the radiator in the bedroom at the first faint sign of spring, and it was chilly now. He shivered as he undressed. Then he stood naked, staring at the bed in perplexity. "What is it?" she asked. "I'm hungry and I don't know what I want." She made a few suggestions. He continued to look nettled. Then she said, "Oh, come to bed." And he fell heavily beside her as though he'd been struck down by a blow. She let the magazines slide to the floor, then picked up a Balzac novel from her bedside table. But Madame de Bargeton's ambition and poignant ineptitudes did not hold her attention. Her mind slid away from the page. Otto was asleep beside her. She sat up against her pillows for a long time, wondering what thing it was she was thinking about just beneath the feigned attention she was giving to those random topics that now drifted through her mind. Deliberately, she visualized the living room of their Flinders farmhouse, then blurring that bright, familiar place. That bright, familiar place, another room began to form, the skimpy parlour of her childhood, her father and a friend speaking late into the evening, while she lay drowsily on the Victorian sofa, listening to the drone of the men's low voices, feeling on her cheek the sting of a horsehair which had worked its way up through the black upholstery, safe and dreaming of the brilliance of her own true grown-up life to come. She put her hand on her cheek and touched the place where the horsehair had pricked, and she gasped at the force of a memory that could, in the space of a breath taken and released, expunge the distance between sleepy child and exhausted adult, as though, she thought, it had taken all these years to climb the stairs to bed. Pretty good.
Why? I think we know why. One could argue with Franzen about whether the Desperate Characters is indeed better than anything written by Bellow, Roth, or Updike. But the thing that we can take from that, which I think is true, and the thing that we've encountered on Backlisted a lot, is why do you think Desperate Characters was out of print for years and could be considered a lost book? Anyone?
No market.
Well, maybe no market. I think it's because the author is a woman.
Yeah.
One of the things we've run into a lot on Backlisted is we've been recommended a series of books by women writers such as Sylvia Townsend Warner, Barbara Cummings, another writer that I'm going to come on to in a moment, who I find it, when I look back at the books that I've read in the last few years, I'm increasingly baffled as to why these books should be lost at all when they are manifestly so good. And certainly, if you were writing fiction in New York in the early 1970s, you were up against some of the most important and most male writers of the 20th century. Now, I love Roth and Updike I have yet to find the bellow for me. But this book is as good as their books. And
it's just subtle, and it's short, and its architecture is much denser, but what it's trying to do, I think, is every bit as ambitious as certainly the great grandstanding ambition of Updike in his Rabbit books. It's compressed into this book, into the subtlety and the precision of the language is just remarkable. And again, you cannot get this book on a single reading. You have to go back and reread, and every time you read it, it's
also more. A book about the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s. The effect of the social upheaval of the 1960s on bourgeois America by people who know something is happening, but they don't know what it is.
There's so many unsettling and disturbing scenes in the book, but also little bit passages like that of real. I mean, you think about them. The language is so, as I say, it has such precision to it.
And again, this is an example of a book that is lost but hiding in plain sight. This book is in print again now. Partly because I think we will look back on this era as being a great era, an era of plenty, because there are different ways of getting books out to people that didn't exist 20 years ago. So this book would have been very difficult to find out about 20 years ago. But now you can buy one on the internet, you can download it, you could start reading it now if you wanted. If you're fed up of listening to me talk, get it on your phone and start reading it.
Franson incidentally said he didn't think it had fallen. He makes the woman point, but he also said because it had a bad title. I don't think it's a bad title, but I kind of see what he means. Desperate Characters sounds a little bit generic. Yeah. But I like it because they don't appear to be at all desperate until kind of halfway through the book, and you realise that they are very desperate indeed. It's brilliantly constructed, perfect novel. But let's go to the seaside towns of Kent next.
How many people have heard of this book? I'm confident here on this one. This is called All the Devils Are Here by David Seabrook. No one. Excellent.
This is genuinely lost. Out of print lost.
Right, when we did an episode on this book about 18 months ago, I am happy to tell you that although you cannot buy it here tonight, in 2 weeks' time, you will be able to buy it because the publisher are bringing it back into print because of the response partly to our podcast. I'm so proud of that because it shows that you can make a difference. It's called All the Devils Are Here. It's by David Seabrook. I taught some creative writing at the start of this year, and the book that I taught with was this one. And on week one of my students said to me, "Mr. Miller," I said, "Yes." She said, "Why have you made us read this awful book?" And I said, "Because most books are like other books, except this one." And 2 weeks later, she came in and she said, "I'm so grateful you made us read this awful book. It's fantastic." I made them read, these poor students, I made them read this book twice. Because when they came in and said, "Oh, I didn't like it," I went, "Wrong. That is the wrong response. You are at fault. You haven't understood it. Go away and read it again, and then we'll talk." So I am evangelical about this book. It's called All the Devils Are Here by David Seabrook.
Plot summary?
Okay, so David Seabrook, who's no longer with us, he died under mysterious circumstances about 7 or 8 years ago. He lived in Canterbury in Kent. He grew up in Kent. He was quite a strange individual. And this book was discovered by the writer Ian Sinclair, who used to run a second-hand bookstall in Camden Passage in Islington in London. And there was a bloke who used to come in regularly and talk at Ian Sinclair for half an hour at a time. So have you heard about the murderer Richard Dadd? And Ian Sinclair would go, "Not really." And he'd go, "Let me tell you something." And he'd talk for half an hour. And after a while, Ian Sinclair said, "You ought to write some of these down." And David Seabrook said, "That's funny, I have done. Would you like to sell my pamphlets here on your stall?" And after a while, Sinclair contacted his editor at the publisher Granta and said, "I think there's a book here. I think if you take the best of these pamphlets and weave them together, you have a book." Now, we talked about already books that are the result of obsession. I don't know what this book is about. It's so wonderful. Ian Sinclair wrote a review of it when it came out in the London Review of Books that said, "David Seabrook gives the reader an ear bashing they will never forget. It is like being trapped in a pub with a madman who has decided to tell you all the things that he is most interested in the world, whether you want to hear them or not. It is like being poked in the chest by a drunk. It is magnificent. That is not something that you get from the novels of Margaret Drabble, for instance. You do not get the sense of a man unravelling before you. And what All the Devils Are Here is really about is the story of David Seabrook's nervous breakdown. And I say that having read it several times and having had students look at me and say, "Why are you making me read this?" Because it channels obsession, passion, and tremendous erudition. It's about events that happened in Kent throughout history. The painter Richard Dad's and the murder of his father, Lord Haw-Haw, who lived in Broadstairs for a while. It talks about Charles Hawtrey, the actor from the Carry On films, who drank himself to death in the coastal town of Deal. And it manages to do so in a way that is totally beguiling, totally disturbing.
I mean, deeply disturbing. I think when we did the podcast, Rachel Cook, who was our guest journalist, said it's a book that makes you terrified of Seabrook, but also terrified for him, because that he doesn't really seem to have a sense of self-preservation or of boundaries. Yeah. This is a book, unlike Jean Rhys. It's not a surprise to discover that David Seabrook is not alive. He's pushing in a way that a lot of what are called psychogeographers, people who write books about walking and exploring the underbelly of this or that. This is the real thing. This is as strange and as raw, but he's a really, really remarkable writer, and the stories that he tells are kind of compelling and unsettling. It's almost gothic in its kind of compelling strangeness and otherness, and you find yourself going back to it.
I took part in an event in Whitstable last year where people read this book out loud from beginning to end in the course of a day,
which is quite odd.
It was quite an odd experience. Have you ever had that thing where you've been reading something out loud and you've thought to yourself, "Oh yeah, this wasn't ever meant to be read out loud"? That's what this book is like at points. And yet at the same time, on the next page there will be some incredible fact or joke or revelation or moment of clarity amidst the ranting and the obsession, where you think, "Wow, I've never read anything like that." So I'm just going to read you now the very beginning of this book. It will give you a tiny flavour, but you'll see what he does in just these 2 paragraphs. At some stage in the early 18th century, it changed its character. An insignificant fishing village on the Kent coast became England's first commercial bathing resort, catering annually for the thousands who came to test for themselves the newly alleged curative and health-giving properties of its seawater. It developed accordingly and grew so popular that by the end of the century it had changed its character again, shedding its genteel image and becoming the first resort to cater for the working classes. Vast numbers of cockneys descended on the town by cheap direct sale from London. They came to bathe, to drink, to whoop it up. The slide had begun. William Cowper observed that Margate, though full of company, was generally filled with such company as people who were nice in their choice of company were rather fearful of keeping company with. There are hunched, sedated souls lingering in cafes and souped-up milk bars. There are groups of squabbling Albanians outside. There are the young men on the front, this front, all bare arms, body art and fast-working, furious faces. Faces that ought to be spouting water from the walls of Gothic buildings. But they are here, and they speak, spraying spittle. And you can feel Seabrook beginning to lose his rag. With you, the reader. I love books where the writer becomes impatient with the stupid reader he's forced to try and communicate with. His captive audience who doesn't understand him. And yet those books capture something really true about our desire to communicate, even when we can't always make ourselves understood. So that is All the Devils Are Here. You cannot buy that at the moment. Thanks to us, you will be able to buy it in a couple of weeks' time. You will get an ear bashing you will never forget. John.
Total change of pace. So Long, See You Tomorrow, William Maxwell.
How many people have heard of that?
Some of you will have maybe heard of it.
Yes. Great.
Okay, so Maxwell famously was the fiction editor at the New Yorker from 1936 to 1976, 40 years, responsible for Nabokov, Salinger, Eudora Welty, Frank O'Connor, John Cheever, the golden age of the of American fiction, 20th century fiction. By all accounts, a brilliant editor. One of my favourite books is a correspondence between Maxwell and Frank O'Connor called The Happiness of Getting It Down Right, and it's letters between a writer and an editor. If you ever want to know about the art of editing, sensitive editing, it's in there. He was, Eudora Welty said for authors, he was author central. When Salinger had finished Catcher in the Rye, he drove out to Maxwell's house to read him the first draft of the book. That's how important in American letters Maxwell was. The reason that this is a lost book is it's a late book. It was written published in 1982 in America. It won the National Book Award. It won several other awards. It was shortlisted for the Pulitzer. Maxwell was 74. He'd written 6 novels over a very long period of time. None of them had ever become bestsellers, but So Long, See You Tomorrow got a lot of attention. Incredibly, and this is where I come into the story, it was never published in the UK. I discovered this book through talking to an agent at Frankfurt. They gave it to me. I had one of those things that don't happen very often. I wish they happen more often as a publisher. You go home, you read a book and come, so this is clearly a masterpiece. Why has nobody done this in the UK? Yeah. And again, I think part of the problem is he's such a quiet writer. The story is actually most of his books are set in the town in Illinois, Lincoln, Illinois, which is the setting for this book. Again, it's another tiny perfect book. It is about a dispute between a farmer and a farm labourer. The farm labourer is having an affair with the farmer's wife. It starts with a pistol shot. You know immediately, it's one of the great things about this book, who's been killed and who killed him, and then the murderer commits suicide. But what it's really about is childhood, and it's about the relationship between 2 boys, the narrator and Cletus, who is the child of the father who is the murderer and who then drowns himself. And without giving away, I mean, it's not really a book about, again, that's about plot, but the major thing that happens, the boys become friends, and then at a crucial moment, there is a moment when they meet later, and the narrator fails to acknowledge Cletus and passes on. I'm going to read that little bit in a moment. And then the book is written as a recollection later in life of why he'd let his friend down in this way. It's perfect in its way. The sort of the bits of Maxwell's history that you kind of need to know about is that he lost his mother in the flu epidemic in 1918 when he was 10 years old, and he said when she died, the shine went out of everything and stayed out for a long, long while. He wrote his first novel, They Came Like Swallows, about, again, the same, in a way, very similar story about a boy who loses his mother. And then at the very end of his life, this is the last book that Maxwell wrote. He publishes So Long, See You Tomorrow. We published it in the UK. I'm pleased to say it's been in print ever, so it's not as lost as it was. But it's just a really interesting example of a writer. I mean, I think he is absolutely, Maxwell should be read alongside the great writers that he published. But he's quiet.
Yeah.
And he can do more, as Ben Cheever's son said, he can do more with a pause than most writers can do with a paragraph. And if you are interested in perfectly turned, deeply humane writing, particularly good on family, particularly good on loss, then I think Maxwell is, he will be, I hope that his reputation will continue to rise. It's so many writers that you meet. I was very fortunate at Harvard when we published this book. We also published Richard Ford, and Richard Ford said, "Well, that's the book that made me write Rock Springs." He said, Maxwell suddenly had reinvented the short novel. But let me just read you the kind of, it comes bang in the middle of the 120-page novel on page 60. But this is the key moment. The school building was of grey stone and enormous. It was 10 times as big as the old overcrowded yellow brick high school in Lincoln, and the classrooms I had to go to were sometimes far apart. One day, during the first week or so of school, I was hurrying along a corridor that was lined with metal lockers. I saw Cletus Smith coming toward me. It was as if he had risen from the dead. He didn't speak. I didn't speak. We just kept on walking until we had passed each other. And after that, there was no way that I could have not done it. I could not have done it. Why didn't I speak to him? I guess because I was so surprised, and because I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what was polite in the circumstances. I couldn't say, I'm sorry about the murder and all that, could I? In Greek tragedies, the chorus never attempts to console the innocent bystander, but instead, sticking to broad generalities, grieves over the fate of mankind, whose mistake was to have been born in the first place. If I had been the elderly man I am now, I might have simply said his name, or shaken my head sadly and said, I know. But would that have been any better? I wasn't an elderly man. The bloodhounds had never been after my father, and I didn't know, how could anybody know, how many times has such a thing happened to a 13-year-old boy, what he had been through. Any more than a person who hasn't had a car door slammed on his fingers knows what that is like. Boys are, from time to time, found hanging from a rafter or killed by a shotgun, believed to have gone off accidentally. The wonder is, it happens so seldom. I think if I had turned and walked along beside him and not said anything, it might have been the right thing to do. But that's what I think now. It has taken me all these years even to imagine doing that. And I had a math class on the second floor, clear at the other end of the building, and there was just barely time to get there before the bell rang.
We've talked about some esoteric books this evening. I have to say, So Long, See You Tomorrow by William Maxwell is exquisitely written and will also break your heart, that it has both the intellectual and emotional power. And unlike, as we keep saying, you need to read it several times, you only need to read this one once.
You really do.
And finally, how many people have read any novels by Anita Bruckner? Yes. Excellent. How can a novel by Anita Bruckner, winner of the Booker Prize in 1984 for Hotel du Lac, be lost? Well, Julian Barnes, her friend, said after she died in March last year, her great mistake was to write a novel a year. Because the publishing industry, her publishers, the journalists, book critics, could not deal with somebody so productive. And what happened with Bruckner who for me is the writer who I've discovered in the last few years who has become completely central to my reading life, is that she was so consistently excellent it was possible to entirely ignore her. And by
Lost in plain sight, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, by the end of her life those novels were selling a few hundred copies. She received moderately good reviews. People always said of her, she writes the same book every time. But that's like saying Henry James writes the same book every time. No, he doesn't. Don't be ridiculous. Bruckner worked a particular area and she wrote in a particular style, but the range within that style is remarkable. And the book that we talked about on Backlisted, which has become the most popular episode of Backlisted, our most listened to episode, and mentioned in the New York Review of Books and in the Paris Review, and I suggest to you, if you would like to go and listen to an episode of Backlisted, if you listen to our episode about Anita Bruckner's novel Look at Me, that might be a good place to start. This was her third novel. This is the novel she published the year before she wrote Hotel du Lac. I think this is probably the best book that I've read in the last 10 years. It manages to be devastatingly heartbreaking in terms of its depiction of a single woman whose options are running out, but also incredibly brave. Similar to Jean Rhys in a way, Anita Bruckner said of Jean Rhys, well, I like her work, but it is limited by her pathology. Well, you could make the same argument about Bruckner, and yes, at the same time, Bruckner has an ability to pin, certainly, the life of the writer to the page. And I'm going to read you a little bit now from the beginning of the book, which I think is amongst the best definitions of why people write that I've ever read. And then we're going to open it up to questions. And I acknowledge this evening that we have covered some pretty depressing stuff. But get ready, because this is by far and away the bleakest thing that we've done tonight. And then we'll have some questions. Sometimes I wish it were different. I wish I were beautiful and lazy and spoilt and not to be trusted. I wish, in short, that I had it easier. Sometimes I find myself lying awake in bed after one of these silent evenings, wondering if this is to be my lot, if this solitude is to last for the rest of my days. Such thoughts sweep me to the edge of panic, for I want more, and I even think that I deserve it. I have something to offer. I am no beauty, but I am quite pleasant looking. In fact, people tell me that I am attractive, which always depresses me. It is like being told that you are brilliant, which means precisely nothing. But apart from that, I am in good health, have ample private means, I have few bad habits apart from my sharp tongue. I have no religion, but I observe certain rules of conduct with considerable piety. I feel quite deeply, I think. If I am not very careful, I shall grow into the most awful old battle axe. That is why I write, and why I have to. When I feel swamped in my solitude, and hidden by it, physically obscured by it, rendered invisible in fact, writing is my way of piping up, of reminding people that I am here. And when I have ordered my characters, plundered my store of images, removed from them all the sadness that I might feel in myself, then I can switch on that current that allows me to write so easily once I get started, and to make people laugh. That, it seems, is what they like to do. And if I manage this well enough and beguile all the dons and the critics, they will fail to register my real message, which is a simple one. If my looks and my manner were of greater assistance to me, I could deliver this message in person. Look at me, I would say. Look at me. But since I am on my own in this matter, I must use subterfuge and guile, and with a bit of luck and good management, This particular message will never be deciphered, and my reasons for delivering it in this manner remain obscure. My toes are curling in my shoes in pleasure as I read that to you. It's so wonderful. This book is full of the terror and sadness and horror and humour and emotion of being alive. And that sounds like hyperbole, but it isn't. I am passionate about this book and about many of the books that we've talked about.
And I hadn't read any Bruckner until we did the podcast, and I've read, I think, 5 now. Much as I hadn't read, to my shame, any Muriel Spark, which has been the same. And so I think one of that, I mean, Bruckner is just, like Spark, they are so good. They are so good. I think they do get undervalued, because it's, unless you actually read the books. I mean, if you're just looking at a box that says lonely woman, former academic, didn't start writing until she was in her 40s, it's very easy. It'd be very easy to dismiss them. But when you, as Andy's, I think, brilliantly picked that, I mean, she's so strong on character. But just the elegance of the writing and the precision again. I think maybe that's, in the end, it's all these writers. It's the lesson is, you got to read the whole thing. You got to read it to the end, and in some cases you maybe have to read it more than once. But that's the difference between literature and entertainment.
And also the other thing to say is, all these books are available.
Yeah.
You know, we live in an era where we are expected to have opinions about the new thing all the time. You know, new books are published all the time. Tens of thousands of books published every year, but at the same time, there's this superabundance of backlisted titles which do not have critical apparatus around them, which are right here in this shop, which might sell 2 or 3 copies a year, which could potentially change your life if you are lucky enough to pick the right book at the right moment. It doesn't even have to be anyone you've heard of. It doesn't have to be famous. It doesn't have to have been reviewed in the TLS. All you need to do is to keep reading.
Have we got time for questions?
We've got time for a few quick ones, I think.
Any questions?
I agree.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think I'm okay.
That's okay, we need it.
Oh, you want for the camera? I just want to make a quick comment about the book you talked about, the creative writing class, The Devil.
Yeah, All the Devils Are Here by David Seabrook.
What it reminded me of the most is nothing to do with another book, but I spent one night in a jail in New York, as one does. And when I got in at the beginning of the night, around 10 p.m., I was stuck listening to the ramblings of insane people on drugs all around me.
Yeah.
And when I first got in there, I was like, these people are crazy. I got to tune this out. And then after all night, no sleep, no food, you can't tell what time it is, I was like, you know, they're starting to make a lot of sense. And I was like, yeah, you know, he's got some points about communism and... Oh, anyway, so it just kind of reminded me of that. In terms of...
Well, listen, this book will spirit you right back there, which I'm sure you will.
I think that's an interesting thing, though, about reading. I have learnt that people always say, how do you say even more to Andy, how do you read so much? And the answer is, you have to choose to make the time to do it. And I find that early in the morning, when you're kind of weirdly... I don't know, your imagination seems more porous in a way. It's that thing is you find that it's quite difficult to pick up a book and read a book on a kind of subway or a train and get yourself into the zone where the story really begins to kind of it's so actually, and I mean, I'm not here to sell Andy's book, but if you want a book about reading, then The Year of Reading Dangerously is there's lots of helpful tips, aren't there, Andy?
Read 50 pages a day. I can't repeat my material from last year. That would be unacceptable. There is, however, and the reason why I've got no. So I'm not going to read something by me. I'm going to read something by Michel Houellebecq. The epigraph of one of the epigraphs of The Year of Reading Dangerously is taken from Extension du domaine de la lutte Welbeck, whatever as it's known in English. And the reason I chose this, which should become clear from what you've heard me talk about tonight, he's talking about writing, and he describes writing as being, he says writing brings scant relief. He says it lends a touch of coherence, the idea of a kind of realism, but you stumble around in a cruel fog. And then he goes on to say, what a contrast with the absolute miraculous power of reading. An entire life spent reading would have fulfilled my every desire.
So true.
I already knew that at the age of 7. The texture of the world is painful, inadequate, unalterable, or so it seems to me. Really, I believe that an entire life spent reading would have suited me best. Such a life has not been granted me. I'm very into pick up what you were saying about that, my description of the book reminding you of a particular thing that happened to you. I'm increasingly interested in books that evoke things that aren't other books.
Yeah.
I mean, either real life experience or things from other art forms. I feel like I've read all the things that I want to that fit in the flow of the canon from one book to another, and what I want are books that pull in other things and remind me of other types of experience.
One of the things that Moby Dick does brilliantly is, obviously it is a book about other books, but it's also a book about, I mean, remarkable, deep, felt experience. I mean, nobody can read Moby Dick and not sort of be curious about what life was like on a whaling ship.
On which note?
other profound, pretty profound insight there.
Yeah. No, just you did make me think, John, when you were saying about time for reading.
Yeah.
Of something that George Whitman, who founded this store, said was, I never understand when people say they don't have time for reading. I don't have time for anything else.
Yes.
Which.
Good. Reading fundamentalists. That's
exactly.
What we want. Yeah.
We do have all but one of the books talked about available.
Guess which
tonight.
One we don't have. Yeah.
But hopefully, if you would like to read The Seabrook, I'm pretty sure if it's coming out in a couple of weeks, we should be able to order it for you. Is it Granta?
Yeah.
Again, putting it out. We do also have Andy's books and John's books. So please do buy them, do get them signed. Also, do stick around. This is as it's our final event. Before Christmas, we will be having not only mulled wine, not only mince pies, but also caroling, led by Lex Polson of the Citizens Book Club, which will take over this stage in just a moment. So please feel free to join in. We've printed out the words, although I suspect most of you will know most of them already. Otherwise, please just join me one more time in saying thank you to Andy Miller and John Mitchinson.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.